Our speaker was born in New Jersey, grew up in Florida, and thanks to Air Force ROTC at Florida State University, became an Air Force pilot and went into pilot training, and after 30 years of duty, he had logged 6,500 hours of military flying and a wide variety of other responsibilities. He did many other things in the Air Force and in life than just fly the U-2. He's going to mainly focus on the U-2 today, but he flew the KC-135 jet tanker. He was in charge of, he was the training chief for the Brazilian Air Force. He speaks Portuguese. He was the defense and air attaché in the Philippines and had to spend some time in Luzon, the Philippines, dealing with communist guerrillas. After his Air Force career, he spent 10 years in international aircraft sales with Boeing and still does some business in Brazil thanks to his fluency in Portuguese. He has many decorations, all of which I will not recite, but they include multiple air medals, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Legion of Merit. In addition, if you're at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, he's on the Wall of Honor, and so he's got that too. He's living in Brevard. He and his wife Ann have been there for 25 years, and we're delighted to have Ann with us. I want to thank our speaker for being with us. I'm looking forward to his presentation. And you know, Duke, I mean, doesn't that sound like the name for a U-2 pilot? I mean, you know, I could have been in the Air Force. Hi, I want to be in the U-2 pilot. What's your name, Bob? Nah. I want to be in the U-2. What's your name, Michael? Nah. I want to be in the U-2. What's your name? Duke. You're hired. So, Duke, you're hired to speak to us about the U-2. Give him a hand.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you how pleased and proud and happy we are to be here today. Yeah, I'm going to talk about flying the U-2 and other adventures. And when I think about other adventures, I have to admit that I am humbled, and my life has been, I have so much to be thankful for. You know, last June I turned 90. Next month we'll be married 67 years, and just got a lot to be thankful for. And one of the things I'm thankful for is the fact that for some years I was able to spend hours on end above 70,000 feet, glancing down, looking at the beautiful world that we have before us. That was quite a privilege to be associated with that program. And so here's the outline that I'm going to use in talking today. First, I want to explain to you the term Dragon Lady. You may have heard it, maybe not, but in November 1956, Dragon Lady became the official designation, unclassified designation for the U-2. And we'll talk a lot about the U-2. And I apologize if I get too technical. I'm going to try to avoid that. But anyway, we'll talk about the U-2, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of the U-2 through its history, and then I'll talk about my personal involvement in that, which is basically in three areas: Operation Crow Flight initially, and then actually flying the airplane, and then finally I was kind of in charge of it for some years. And so that's how we're going to proceed. Now, the original Dragon Lady was Madame Deal. Some of you may remember Madame Deal from the Terry and Pirates Milt Caniff cartoon. She was very devious, dangerous, not to be tampered with. And in the early days, you know, it goes back to 34. Well, the U-2 didn't go back that far, but in the early days, the airplane had a very bad reputation early on, even while it was classified. In the first, for example, in the first 3 years, 13 airplanes were lost in accidents, and 11 pilots lost their lives. It was a very unique and very difficult and very difficult to fly in an unforgiving airplane. And so the nickname, the Dragon Lady, kind of stuck right from the very beginning. And as I say, so now it's the official designation for the U-2. The first unit that actually flew the U-2 was the 4080th, and it was a U-2 from the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, at that time in Del Rio, Texas, that overflew Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was the one that Rudy Anderson was flying, one of those airplanes, when he lost his life. And you'll notice the left side of that patch is the Dragon, and so you'll see that continued in the future with other patches used by U-2 organizations. The one on the left, Cozy, Street Cozy, one of the early pilots, Solo 71. I should mention that every U-2 pilot, everyone who ever flew or was qualified to fly the U-2 is assigned a solo number, because now it's been over 1,100, believe it or not. In the 70 years the airplane has been around, over 1,100 individuals have flown the U-2. Every one of those has a solo number. Tony Levere was the Lockheed engineer. He was the number one, solo one. And the designer of that patch on the left, the wife of the designer of that patch, was solo number 71. And anyway, you see that the Dragon, that's an astrolabe on that. It's sort of the old traditional, ancient, mystical navigational device. And on the right, of course, it's just a picture of the airplane, Dragon Lady, and Solom Valois, we fly alone. The U-2, you're flying alone when you're in a U-2, although nowadays there are 4 two-seaters. They didn't exist when I was in the program, and they're basically just for trainers. Okay, let's look at very quickly the historical overview of the airplane over 70 years. Back in 1953, back during the Cold War, there was a requirement to understand what in the heck was going on in the Soviet Union. There was this belief that there was a tremendous bomber gap and that the Russians had fleets of bombers and we didn't, and so forth. And so somebody said, it was a DOD design study, said we've got to have an airplane that can overfly the Soviet Union and take pictures. So the basic requirements were 70,000 feet, which was pretty well thought to be that would keep the airplane safe. Just single seat, subsonic, carry 700 pounds because most of the big cameras were less than that. And so a contract was let. Scott Kelly Johnson, the Lockheed engineer, said, well, I can do that. I can build that. I'll build a 104 and just put a great big wing on it. And as a matter of fact, the cockpit area and some of the fuselage is from an F-104. Of course, entirely different other than that. So in any event, the requirements were put out, and Kurt LeMay, General Kurt LeMay, you may recall the name, thought it was the most stupid idea he'd ever heard of, and he rejected the idea out of hand. No, the Air Force is never going to have a stupid airplane like that. So the CIA said, oh, we'll take it. So that's how the CIA ended up with the airplane first. And for the first few years, only the CIA operated. You don't see it on the chart there, but the upper line of the users, the CIA, for the first few years, after that first flight on the 1st of August in '55, and then the Air Force from then on. NOAA, NASA also has some scientifically assigned airplanes, but I neglected to put them on the target. And then down below, the airplanes themselves, they were the early versions, the smaller airplane, which we'll look at in a minute, and then the U-2R, and then in '94, all the U-2Rs were re-engined with a lighter engine, but with more thrust, and so that's what we have today, 37 U-2S airplanes. So that's kind of a historical overview of the airplane. That's a look at one of the younger, of the first ones, 85. I apologize for the small Don't worry about you can't read all the little letters. You'll see something bigger in just a second. But that's a basic airplane. And let's see if I can, right there, right under the cockpit is called the Q bay, and that's where all the cameras were located. And also on the tail, in the early airplane, right there, you notice, I'll show you a picture in a few minutes that you'll see that the back of the airplane looks quite different on a fully operational C model. So anyway, that's what the early version looked like. Also, that paint scheme, you never see, in fact, I've never seen that, and it was most of the airplane, all of the airplanes, excuse me, all of the U-2s are painted flat black. And the reason for that, at altitude, at above 60,000 feet, if you look straight up, the sky is absolutely black. And so if anyone, and they've tried it a few times, with someone to try to take a fighter, a zoom climb, about 45,000 feet, go to Mach 2, and then zoom climb up to get to the altitude, they're looking at a completely black sky, and so an airplane painted black made it impossible. So it makes it very impossible to see at altitude. And then, of course, the second generation, the U-2R and the U-2S. And so we'll look at that in some detail, but it was a newer airplane. And I was fortunate enough to be in the program early on and then when the new one came into. So I've flown both of those airplanes. One flies so like a sports car, and the other flies like a truck. You can guess which the truck is. Okay, don't be awed by all these numbers. They don't really matter. But the point is, this is a comparison of the first generation, and a lot of different A, B, C, D. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details. They were all the smaller airplane with the 85-foot wingspan, and all of the early airplanes ended up being in the C configuration with a J75 engine. And then, of course, the newer generation, which you notice the size difference, 80 feet, 105 feet. But the curious thing is here that the performance is the same. In fact, the first R model used the same engine as the C model. But you notice that the thrust, the max takeoff were significantly different. So the point is, the performance is pretty much the same, and the reason being that the R model, and now the S, is like a truck. It carries big, heavy sensors, big radomes, whereas the earlier one basically just carried a camera, which was a lot lighter. And so, anyway, a lot more fun, I think, to fly. Okay, my involvement in the U-2 through the years. The black line there, of course, is my 30 years in the Air Force, 1 July 55 to 1 July 85. And I have to correct something that Bob said. For any Air Force veterans out here, there's a big difference between being an ROTC graduate and an aviation cadet. And I was in ROTC, and I got an award and everything, but I was so taken with wanting to fly airplanes, I went ahead and entered the Air Force as an aviation cadet, which meant that I got horribly hazed, and it was a lot tougher to get your wings that way than being an ROTC guy, because then you walked in, you're already a second lieutenant, I'm a college graduate, and it was a different deal altogether being an aviation cadet. But of course, some of my classmates became general officers, so I'm not ashamed of it at all. Anyway, there were 3 phases of my involvement with the U-2. The first is Operation Crow Flight, which I'll explain to you in just a little bit. And then there was a break. And the break, well, I should mention that I went through basic pilot training in the non-jet era. I flew the B-25, the Billy Mitchell airplane, believe it or not, as an aviation cadet. So I graduated from basic multi-engine. So when I graduated and got my wings, I wasn't yet qualified, which was like having the bubonic plague. But I was able to remedy that, and I'll explain that in a minute, because later I was able to go to jet qualification course. And so it was at that period that I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the jet qualification course right in the break after the crow flight. And then I had a school assignment, then I flew tankers. And then I actually flew the airplane for 3 years, actually a little under 4. And then I was in charge of the U-2 operation worldwide for a couple of years. And then I did some other things. So about 26% of my total 30 years were involved with the U-2. Okay, so I got out of pilot training. I was flying in Charleston, South Carolina, C-54, which is a World War II non-pressurized 175-knot max airspeed transport. And it was a great flying experience, lots of weather time, and really good assignment. I was a newlywed, so Ann and I were there in Charleston, South Carolina. Love it, good life. But I'd only been there less than a year, and I and some of my squadron mates were taken aside, and we were given a briefing. You're being assigned to a new classified organization. You're going to be supporting a classified secret mission. You're going to go overseas, and if you accept, and blah, 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 blah. And so we ended up having an assignment to a special unit that was assigned to support something called Project Crowflight. And Project Crowflight was a highly classified mission of the U-2s. Here we are, everybody thinks the U-2s, you take pictures, yes, but in the early days, the way we learned about the Soviet nuclear tests was sending U-2s up and taking paper samples, or paper filter rather, of the debris that had been deposited up in the atmosphere, and our scientists then could tell the yield of the weapon, whatever a nuclear scientist can glean from the particles that were left up in the atmosphere. So this project was a high altitude, a 40/80th, out of the same outfit that was the active photographic unit with the U-2. And they were going to take hot samples right out of the radioactive clouds. And we had operating locations in both North and South America, and my unit was to be down below, flying along where the U-2s were, so if they had to jump out or they flamed out, because in those days the airplane was not all that reliable, or if something happened and the pilot had to jump out, he'd be down over the South Atlantic or over the polar regions of Canada. Somebody said, hey, we got to have some rescue guys up there, and that was my job. And so, hello. Okay. The U-2 had some specialized equipment, and you can see that it had, in the Q bay, it had a special device that, well, first of all, on the outside, it collected the air, and then on the inside of the Q bay was something with a bunch of paper filters, and then in the nose of the airplane, you could just take in a stream of air, and with pumps, and they would highly pressurize the air, so it would take a huge sample of air from the Soviet weapons. And so that was the airplane that was equipped to perform that mission. I don't know why we're not, okay. Okay, this shows our home station, of course, was in Puerto Rico, and these show the various tracks where the airplanes were. The only one that I really want to talk about basically was because it was 100% of our effort. We had an operating location in Ezeiza International Airport in Buenos Aires, and what would happen is 3 days a week we would take off either north or south, and about 2 hours later the U-2 would take off right behind us and overfly us, so that the whole time that the U-2 was airborne, we were airborne somewhere in the vicinity, so that if you had a problem, we were there to rescue him, to save him. And so that was basically the mission. And there I am with my crew. And of course, it was a C-54, just like we were flying out of Charleston, but we had a big door where the paratrooper, the medics could jump out, and we could also drop rafts and equipment to a pilot if need be. And the crew consisted of a co-pilot and a navigator and a flight engineer and some medics, some paramedics. And so that went on for about 2 years. And then the unit moved back to Texas, and the South American portion of it ceased, and then the Canadian portion continued. And so we were flying out of Texas, Bergstrom, Austin, Texas. And at that time, and I failed to mention that when we were in Buenos Aires, that's when the first time that I became intimately familiar with the U-2. And of course, I was fascinated by it, but not being jet qualified, I had absolutely no chance to ever fly the U-2, I thought. But when we went back to Texas and I got a school assignment, I had 6 months to wait for the school assignment, and lo and behold, I had the opportunity to go down the road to San Antonio and go into a 6-week course called the JQC, the Jet Qualification Course, to fly the T-33. Lo and behold, before I went to school, I was able to get that ticket punched. So now I'm going to school. That's the bad news, because at the end of a school assignment, they're going to make me go behind a large steel desk for a couple of years. But at least I was jet qualified, so I thought, well, there's maybe a chance that someday I'll be able to fly the U-2. So I went to school, and 8 months, this was at the University of Colorado, so 8 months into that assignment, still dreaming about flying the U-2, something happened, something very big, something very important. The Berlin Wall went up. Boom. All of the school assignments were canceled, and lo and behold, I find myself back in the cockpit flying SAC KC-135 jet tankers. Well, that was a really, really significant assignment because Cold War, and it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred during that, and that article that Bob mentioned describes in great detail what the role was for the tankers. And so I'm back in the cockpit, and lo and behold, in 1966, my world changed completely because the Air Force put out a call for volunteers for the U-2. And that was, a dream come true. I had punched all the tickets, and so I'd have an opportunity to become a U-2 pilot. And of course, that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, there's a picture of a C model, which was all of the smaller, the early airplane. That was the finalized configuration. And you mentioned, I remember that I mentioned about the rear. That was the sugar scoop. And you can see the end of the wing that's has that area down there so you wouldn't damage the wing when you land, because the pogo is just an outrigger pogo. And that weighs 200 pounds, and what that would fall off the airplane as you were taking off. And that was very important that it fall off, because if it's stuck, and if a pilot screwed up and let wing one fall down and touch if the wheels touched the runway as you were taking off, in other words, if you didn't keep the wings level and you let one wing down, then the airplane was accelerating so rapidly that the air loads could cause the pogo to be stuck and it wouldn't free fall. And then if you got airborne and you still had a pogo in the wing, then you had a serious problem, because it was almost impossible to get rid of the pogo, so you've lost the mission. And in fact, one of the very first fatal accidents in the U-2 had to do with a pilot who took off, had a stuck pogo. He slowed the airplane trying to shake loose the pogo and lost control of the airplane, and it crashed. And in all operational flying, what we would do is we'd come out onto the runway, and then someone would go out and stand there and hold the wingtip. They would remove the pogos, so you didn't have the pogos in the wing as you take off or as you accelerate. And they would just remove the pogo and then you release the brakes, and the acceleration was so rapid that you got airborne long before a wing could fall. Okay, so that's what the cockpit looks like. It's a very tiny cockpit. The ejection ring there, and it's you notice a yoke. There's no stick, and right there is a cone looking at the scope that's used for navigation. It's a very crowded cockpit, extremely tight. There's a pilot you can see is just getting out. And you notice the canopy there, that's a manually closed canopy, open and closed, and that's a 104 canopy. And the fuselage is very similar. You can barely make it there, but right there you see a little glass hemisphere. That's air conditioning, you can ignore that. But right there at the top of the fuselage is a little glass hemisphere, and that's used for celestial navigation. We actually use celestial. And then there's a system where you're also looking down through the belly of the airplane for navigating visually. So when you're in and all tucked in, it's pretty tight. There's a rear view mirror. Right there is a rear view mirror. You can look up into it. And that was a lot of fun when you're coming down, putting out a contrail, and you're looking behind and you see this contrail going out behind you at an incredible speed. It's always kind of a thrill. Interestingly enough, you can see how tight everything is. One of the requirements of being able to get into the program in the early days was you could not have a sitting height that exceeded 36.5 inches from the bottom of your butt to the top of your head. If you exceeded that, the airplane was just too small and you had to go fly something bigger. Now, why in the world would I show you a picture of a T-6? I was a member of the last class in the United States Air Force to fly the T-6. I mean, that's the AT-6. That goes back many, many years. The student, of course, most of the time flew in the front seat, right? But when we had instruction on instrument flying, then the student for that flight would ride in the back seat. And we had a cloth hood you'd put over it so you couldn't see outside. The instructor rode in front, and the student learned how to fly instruments. Well, toward the end of the course, after we'd finish an instrument period and we're going back to land, the instructor would say, I'll never forget the day he said to me, "Mr. Woodhull," it was always Mr. Woodhull, I was a cadet, "Mr. Woodhull, how would you like to land the airplane today?" Whoa, from the back seat? You can imagine, because the airplane would land in that attitude. You always land the T-6 just in a full stall, just like that. And you can imagine if you're sitting in the back seat, you can't see anything at all. It's kind of like landing a U-2. That's exactly the picture that you have in a U-2. You got all this stuff in front of you, and the airplane, you're deliberately getting down close to the ground, slowing down in an airplane with a big wing, and the airplane is barely controllable, and for that reason it's somewhat dangerous, barely controllable, and now you can hardly see out of the thing. So that was one of the challenges, and for that reason, that's one of the reasons why we had a mobile vehicle racing behind the aircraft to radio to the pilot, telling him what his height is above the runway. And it would sound like this, you'd come over the end of the runway, and then the pace car would race behind you, and he'd say, "Okay, looking good, 1 foot, 1 foot, 6 inch, 6 inch, hold it off." And the idea was to hold it off the runway, not touching down prematurely, and get a full stall, because if you made the mistake of touching down the main gear first with the tail wheel still up, then what happened? You would get a terrible porpoise, and you were already 2 knots above stall, and then you get a porpoise, now you're 10 feet in the air and the airplane stalled. You can't allow that to happen. So that's why the mobile was very important to, especially after long missions when you're just exhausted. I should mention too that for every mission, 2 pilots were always scheduled. There was always the pilot who was going to fly the mission and mobile, because as you're getting suited up and getting all your papers ready, the mobile would go out to the airplane, take your papers, pre-position, cock the cockpit, and then as you taxied out, he would pace you going out. You got on the runway, and then the last thing they would do, if it was in a home station, they'd pull the pins on the pogos. Operationally, they just remove the pogos. Anyway, the mobile and the mobile officer was a big part of the operation always. Okay, that's the partial pressure suit. It's rather primitive, but that's what we would use in the early airplane. It's not really a suit at all. It's nothing more than a get-me-down suit that if you lose pressurization completely, it'll keep you alive. The capstans on the wing, on the arms and on the feet, and also in the chest area and on the thighs, there was a bladder there that if you lost pressurization, I'm talking about complete pressurization, if a canopy flew off or you flamed out, then all of a sudden your body is up at 70,000 feet, you would die quickly. And of course, so you had to have something that would save your life if you became completely depressurized. As it was, we were in the cockpit, we were at 32,000 feet, which is the altitude of the bends. So to prevent you from having the bends, because the cockpit could only be pressurized down to about 32,000 feet. So your body is still at altitude, even though you're at 70,000 feet. And so to prevent getting the bends, before every flight, we would pre-breathe 100% oxygen for an hour or two to saturate our systems in oxygen, which would prevent the nitrogen from coming out in solution and causing the bends. And so that's the primitive partial pressure suit that we used. And then, of course, you just put a normal flying suit over it, and we were wearing a parachute on the back, and you were sitting on a seat kit in the airplane that had oxygen bottles in it, so that if you had to bail out, as you free fell, the oxygen bottle in the seat pack with you would keep you alive as you free fell down for several minutes. The helmet. Sometimes it was excruciatingly uncomfortable, but of course you're breathing 100% oxygen all the time. You can't see it very well in this picture, but the faceplate there has a very fine screen. It's a heating element, otherwise it could fog up. And you could never open that faceplate in flight at altitude, because even at 32,000 feet, which is what the cockpit was at, you'd only have 60 to 90 seconds of useful consciousness before you'd pass out. And so when you close that faceplate and you started pre-breathing an hour or two before takeoff, from then through the flight until you were descending at the end of the flight, descending through 10,000 feet, that faceplate had to stay on and closed. You could not open it in flight. And you just imagine not being able to rub your eyes or, rub your nose or something. Sometimes it was, well, let me put it this way. Every flight, when you're descending, coming through 10,000 feet and you can open the faceplate, it was excruciatingly enjoyable. I could use a different expression, but I'm telling you, it was a wonderful sensation on every flight. The qualification process, everyone had to be a volunteer. Absolutely had to be a volunteer. The selection process involved, you had to put all your records together, and they considered what your operational history was, all your previous check rides, and then your physical. You had to take a physical, and one of which was, as I said, 36.5 inches. It didn't matter if you were Superman, but if you had If you were bigger than 36.5 inches sitting height in the early days, you wouldn't fit in the airplane. In initial qual, you had a ground school, lots of time because we had no two-place trainer, lots of cockpit time. And on your IQ-1, your initial solo, because you were alone the first time, that was a critical moment. Every solo pilot has that date in his mind. In my case, it was 14 December 1966. And in the long line of 1,100 pilots that have flown the airplane, I'm number 224. So I'm IQ 224. Tony Revere is 1. Francis Gary Powers is solo 25, and so forth. But then you had the IQ 2, 3, 4, and 5 with all low altitude, just learning how to fly the airplane without crashing, touch and goes, and some instrument training. And then IQ 6 was the first time you put the pressure suit on and you went above 60,000 feet. And that was particularly noteworthy because once you got to altitude on IQ 6, you shut the engine down deliberately. And the reason for that was because it was important for the pilot to experience what the airplane would fly like or feel like flamed out at max altitude. And more than that, when you depressurized, the suit would inflate and you learned what that would feel like. And so it was a very, very good training exercise to do that. And then the airplane would glide down and you get down around 35,000 feet or so on that particular mission, IQ 6. And then you get a relight and you go in and land. On my IQ 7, which was usually the last checkout, IQ 7, was the second time you put the suit on and you went to max altitude. Only this time you did some celestial navigation and you flew on a long mission. And on my IQ 7, 2.5 hours after takeoff, I was over Idaho. The engine flamed out. It exploded. The turbine section of the engine lost about 8 teeth all in a row, and the engine exploded. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting there, and with a big bang, the engine stops, and the suit is inflated, and I'm thinking, oh boy, what am I going to do? Well, what I did, obviously, I would have to do was either find an airfield that I could land in, or eventually, if I couldn't find one, I'd have to bail out because the airplane, you wouldn't survive with just a crash landing. Well, to make a long story short, I was able to find a landing site after going through some clouds, and was able to, with Seattle Center's help, tell me where this particular base was. It was Kingsley Field in Klamath Falls, Oregon. So I got the airplane down. At that moment, I had a grand total of 15 hours in the airplane. So a real neophyte, but it all worked out. And so for a short while, I was a local hero. And then I just went back to continued the other flights. A famous U-2 pilot later became the wing commander for the SR-71 wing, Pat Halloran, Solo 71 in the U-2, was asked once, what's it like flying the U-2? And he was asked that back in the days when he was flying the early version. And these are his words, which I think they really sum it up beautifully. You wear a horribly claustrophobic pressure suit, the one I've shown you. Before takeoff, you do the pre-breathing, you squeeze into a tiny cockpit. The cockpit is really tiny. You can't even move your elbows out. You're really squeezed in there. And then you strive to maintain aircraft control. I didn't mention there's something called a coffin corner. In the U-2, you'd go to altitude, you'd set the power a certain way, and then you had a schedule. As the airplane got lighter, it would fly higher and higher and higher. Roughly 1,000 feet every hour after you got to that first level off point. And so, but as you gradually climbed through the mission, there was a period there between roughly 72 to 74,000 feet. We've referred to it as a coffin corner, where you had about 4 or 5 knots to play with. You were either going too fast and you were going to get transonic flow over the wings and the airplane would start tumbling, or too slow and the airplane would start stalling, falling out of the sky. There was this coffin corner you had to maintain to keep the airplane safe. And so that was a concern that Pat Halloran was referring to. And then, of course, you navigate looking through the drift sight. Most all operational missions, we were simply navigating visually. And just about all of my operational, no, not just about, all, with one exception, all of my operational flying was taking pictures, running the camera. And so you had to worry about operating the mission. And then, of course, he said, and it's so true, that after all that, after 6.5, 7 hours, then you've got to look forward to the challenge of getting the airplane safely back on the ground. So those were his words, and he's really summarized beautifully what it was like. So the crew life, in just a few words, we had multiple operating locations. We had some in the United States, in Southeast Asia, north of Saigon, Benoit, we call it OL-20, and in South America, and I'll show you my last operating location was in South America. The normal tour was always 60 days, and we averaged 3 a year, so just think about that. It was kind of rough on the families. It was rough on the families. It wasn't much fun, and that was one of the aspects of being a U-2 pilot that was very definitely a negative aspect. And that was one of the things that volunteers always had to be told, that this was going to involve a lot of family separations, and it was not any fun at all. Photo reconnaissance was a primary mission. Occasionally we did some aerial refueling, and the average mission was around 6.5 to 7 hours. My last operating location was in Mendoza, Argentina, and we were sampling again. Those those are the old Crow Flight routes, but those were long gone. But we had that one last operating location in El Plumarillo in Mendoza, Argentina, because the French were kicking off nuclear weapons in Tahiti, and so the weather experts became aware when the French kicked off the weapon. Then the weather experts could anticipate when all the debris, the cloud, would approach South America. And so I launched at 3:30 one morning and went into a kind of a sawtooth pattern. I had a Geiger counter in the cockpit, and when it started going crazy, then I just did a racetrack pattern, started changing filters and turning pumps on. And when I came back, the airplane was highly radioactive. A lot of the radioactive debris had been sucked in and in the oil of the airplane. There were certain areas in the airplane where the radioactivity was very, very intense. They measured me, and around my ankles where the air was coming in at me were pretty radioactive, but fortunately I've had no effects from it, thank goodness. So shortly after, one thing I forgot to mention, at the end of that operating location, we were there, of course, and they said, okay, bring the airplane home. So that picture I showed you of the helmet with the faceplate and everything that's on the book, I flew nonstop from Mendoza right back to Austin, Texas, and you can see that the navigation was pretty easy because all I had to do was just keep South America on the right and the Pacific Ocean on the left, and the navigation was, well, it was a boring flight, but it was not very challenging. And so that's where that picture came from. And then when we got back, we find out, oh my goodness, we got this new airplane coming, the R model. The R model, besides being big and holding some big radomes and everything, from a pilot's point of view, there are two very, very important things about the U-2R. First of all, at altitude, it was much safer. The early version airplane, more than about 11 degrees of bank, the airplane would start falling out of the sky. This airplane, you could fly around like a normal airplane. And there was no coffin corner that you needed to worry about in this airplane. You had about 40 knots rather than 4 or 5 to worry about. But one of the big blessings of this airplane was something called the land system. And before landing, you could arm the land switch. And we didn't have it in the early version. But as you got down close to the runway, instead of having to depend upon somebody talking to you, you would arm the land switch, and it was on the throttle, and you just push the button, and the spoilers on both wings would pop up, and the lift of the wings would immediately be reduced to the point where you would just settle right to the runway. It was kind of an automatic soft landing technique, which would made landing much, much less challenging, a lot easier. Of course, the big advantage of the R Model 2 was a full pressure suit. So you didn't have to worry about, I mean, you could stay at altitude. If the airplane's still flying and the camera's still working, you could stay at altitude with a full pressure suit. You could not do that with a partial pressure suit. And it was much more comfortable. And the best thing about it, you could open that helmet at altitude, briefly, and then close it, because it would reliably close and seal. So you could take food, you could take bite-sized pieces of steak, and you could have a meal instead of just liquid, because with the old one, it was strictly liquid. You couldn't take anything solid at all. And that's the cockpit for the U2R. And of course, it's not very different from the earlier version. Still has a yoke, and some of the cockpit instruments are a little more exotic, but other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. And so the transition from the earlier versions to the R model was quite easy. My last assignment then, after I got yanked out of the crew force, and at the time, I was rather ambivalent. I hated to leave the flying, but I wanted to avoid all the time away from home, the TDY. That was horrible. And so I was told that, okay, we're going to grab you and we're going to put you in charge of the office, the U2 office in the SRC, the Strategic Reconnaissance Center. It was a two-man shop. I was in charge of all the worldwide operating locations around the world, 2 guys, and the other one was a navigator. And we were in charge of as the chart shows, mission planning, scheduling, execution, and reporting for all of the units, U2 flights around the world. So it was a gut-wrenching job, 7 days a week and long hours, but it was a very satisfying assignment. Located in the underground of H-Wing at SAC headquarters. And it was, but anyway, it was a terrific assignment, and that was the end of my exposure, involvement with the U-2. I have to brag a little bit. Gary Powers, everybody knows about Francis Gary Powers, and he wrote a book about his experience. There's his book, Operation Overflight. And he sent me a copy of his book, and it's something that I will always treasure. And it says, "Dear Duke, best of luck to a fellow U-bird driver." That's what we refer to ourselves as, drivers. "Best of luck to a fellow U2 driver, and a damn good one. Still don't know how you got that one into Kingsley Field. Francis Gary Powers, August 11, 1970. And I had met him. He would come to our pilots' meetings at Davis-Monthan after he came back from being in prison. So, this is what we've just gone over. The Dragon Lady, you got to probably learn more about the U2 than you really needed to know, but at least you know more than you did before. The 2 generations now, because it's just U2, there are so many different versions. And then, of course, my own personal involvement with the airplane. Hello. I guess it's not going to go anymore, so of course, there's my book. The book is for about 30 years, not just the time that I spent in the U2. Of course, every book has a heroine, and the heroine of the book is right there, Ann Woodhull. But we had a lot of fun, and I'm very thankful for having had 30 years in the Air Force accident-free. And so I hope some of you will enjoy the book. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have. Yes, sir.